you post your question, if you would like to give us your name, preferred phone pronouns if you want, or how you'd like to be addressed, and then I will read them out to the panel. If, of course, you want to direct a question to a particular member of the panel, please do so. Do bear in mind what Sophia has just said about offensive or inappropriate behavior. We will be reviewing the questions before they get read out. If any of them are found to be inappropriate or offensive, they will obviously not be read out, and it could lead to you being asked to leave the space. That said, a lot of the work that we do is a learning process. So don't feel that, if your question is coming from a good place, from a kind place, don't feel that it's necessarily going to create problems. Most of us are very seasoned activists. We're kind of used to explaining things. And as you'll see from the presentations, our journeys with parliamentarians and policymakers has not always been that easy. So I'd like to believe we've got a little bit of a tough skin, and we do merit people beginning in a learning journey. Any technical issues, then Duncan's email is in the chat, duncan.moss@wfd.org. His number is also there. And as Sophia has said, in the interpretation button, I think if I get my right and left correct, is at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and you'll need to flip through from English to Spanish according to who's speaking. So if I see there are no questions about anything so far, so then I'd like to hand the floor over to Baroness Barker. Liz, it's all yours.
Well, good morning, buenos dias. I'm speaking to you from Westminster. I think I already won the best background competition for this event, because this is real. What you don't know is that it's the middle of winter here, so it's absolutely freezing. So it may look great, but I'm going to keep things short because I might freeze to death in the process. I have a slide which I'm not going to attempt to share myself, so I've got somebody to do that for me. And I couldn't start off today without making reference to one of my political heroines. She is Eleanor Roosevelt. What are the major things that you need to know about Eleanor Roosevelt? Well, number one, she was married to Franklin Roosevelt. Number two, she had affairs with women. Number three, some of her best mates were lesbians at a time when that wasn't at all acceptable in the USA. And she's the person why we're here today, because in the 10th of December 1948, due in no small part to the work that she had done, we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In a speech, she said this: where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close, so small, they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the work of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. Not bad for a lady who used to go to school in Wimbledon, where I now live. She is the person who did the single thing that is the most important for all of us. In Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there is a sentence: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and right. All human beings. All. You, me, people we know, people we don't know, people we don't like, people who are different. All human beings. And that is the single most important sentence that we have to work with. Thank you very much. You can take Eleanor away and come back to me if you like. Just say that it's worth hanging on to that, because I'll be honest with you, quite often when I hear people talking about human rights, do you know what? It's really boring. It's very legalistic and it doesn't mean anything. And the single most important thing that you and I and everybody else has to do to make all those high sentiments become real is to make connections with people. And principally, we have to make connections with people who have probably not suffered a lack of human rights, because they're the people in power, and people who are in power are usually the people who are not at the bottom of the heap, and they are singularly uninterested in changing the system that got them into power until such time as it is in their interest to do so. So our job is to work with allies in the first place, to find the principal allies who are going to be the first ones to move. And you know what? They're not in government, they're in opposition. If you look at any major movement for social change of any kind, prison reform, any kind of unpopular thing, the first people to stand up for change are the outsiders. And our job is to work with them and to give them all of the ammunition that we can to do two things. First of all, to fend off the inevitable criticism that will come their way from the people who want to stand up for the status quo and who see them as a threat. And the second is to build that body of law and use those legal principles to do one thing and one thing only, which is to say to those people in power, you don't know it, but actually there may come a time when your human rights are not respected. And if you oppress one person or you oppress one group of people, then you oppress everybody. So our job and my job, and I get to do it here in this fantastic building, I get to do it sitting having cups of tea with people in countries with people where it's illegal to be LGBT, is to build that space where people can begin to ask questions, the daft, stupid questions about lives of people who they don't know, and to let them to begin to understand difference and speak with confidence about it. I'll tell you a story. When I was 22, one of my best friends transitioned. I've been cool with trans people for a very, very long time. Do I really understand all what it means to be a trans person in their life? No, I don't. For me, and I work with, and I'm very pleased my researcher Helen is on our call today. Every day I work with trans, non-binary, intersex people. I was one of the first people ever to raise the subject, intersex people in our parliament. Every day I have the gift of people who are different to me, who will teach me to understand differences and to appreciate differences in greater depth. And in doing that, I help to build a bigger and better society for everybody else. I am immensely privileged. I thought I'd come down here to show you just how privileged I am. But my responsibility is to use my privilege to help me, you, everybody else understand what it is like not to be on the receiving end of abuses of power and not to have our dignity and as human beings respected. If you're ever in doubt, just think about Eleanor and go back to the words that she spoke, and she can be your guiding light. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Liz. That was a really powerful introduction to, I think, what is going to be some great follow-up. I just have a small question. Could you briefly explain to perhaps people who don't know the role and function of the all-party parliamentary group?
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing for people to know exist.
Yeah. We are the most lucky LGBT people on earth. We live in a country where we have very good law, not so good for trans people, we're way behind on that. But by and large, we have some of the best legal situation and the best social acceptance. We are also the country that left behind an absolutely horrible legacy throughout the Commonwealth of laws which are still used to oppress people. So what we do is we use our privilege in this place, first of all, able to hold the United Kingdom government feet to the flames in their international work to make sure that they are, through our involvement in intergovernmental programs and also through our Foreign, Commonwealth and DFID programs, supporting LGBT rights across the world. Our second thing is that we support, we work with civil society, and crucially for us, we work also with the private sector, because using the resources of the reach of the private sector, we can amplify things a lot faster and quicker. And we work with activists and politicians and businesses around the world to hurry up and move forward that agenda for equality. And crucially, what we do is when we get parliamentarians and people coming into this country, as they often do, for training and learning and conferences and all that, we are there raising the issue of LGBT equality. Quite often when they come from places where they don't want to listen to that and they don't want to know about it, and we force the issue. So we use our privilege. That's what we do.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm really sorry if you missed any of that with my dogs barking, because I think it was quite important. They've got bones now, so we should be okay. Thank you very much. Steve, I think a good place to follow up is a look at the global situation, the work around the Commonwealth, and then perhaps if you could land it a little bit with your work and the situation in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I mean, it's really quite important to hear what Liz has raised as an importance of inclusivity and solidarity, and the use of privilege. And I think it's quite important. But what I think is key from where I come from, it's to realize
de Sudáfrica es de realizar, comprender que
still remains a crime in 69 countries across the globe. And of that 69, 31 is within the Commonwealth, and Liz has mentioned the Commonwealth. 31 still is in the Commonwealth. That leaves us one to recognizing and acknowledging the legacy of colonial context. But I think what is key is what people are exposed to. And when we speak about human rights, and I mean this conversation happening on the International Human Rights Day, it's really a kind of reflection, but also a kind of worth that takes us to steps to recognizing what are the risks that people, human beings, are exposed to. And these risks include arrest, include extortion, includes criminalization, discrimination attitude, harassment by police, stigma, and ill treatment on a day-to-day basis, but also the absence of many countries that have a lack of protective legislative framework. And I think that's where we need to be basing our own reflection and what needs to be happening. And of course, we've seen over time when we speak about discrimination and how do we end violence for human beings, there has been member states, whether in the Commonwealth or across the world, in relation to commitments of universal declaration, that has been put in place. For the last over 70 years, universal declaration in the quest of protecting human rights have been in place. But we've seen with all of these efforts that other states have taken in terms of the steps where you've seen positive developments for most countries that lacked comprehensive policy to address human rights violation, particularly against LGBTI persons. Even where there are these countries where you see those steps taken, there aren't a lot of measures that addresses the elements of discrimination. You can change the constitution, but you need to put measures in place that prevents violence and discrimination faced by LGBTI people. So this is in the quest of adopting clear policy frameworks to put in place. I think where you've seen, the status across the world, about about 6 or 7 countries have decriminalized. I mean, we've seen Trinidad and Tobago, we've seen Belize, we've seen Botswana, we've seen Mozambique, Seychelles, and now recently in Africa was Gabon as well. And there's clear intention, but there's also not a government-led intention at times. It's also intentions of work that is led by civil society, where there has been resilience in supporting those efforts, where we seek, to put one for states to account, but as well as parliaments that play a role in terms of deciding on what is a just system approach that should be placed in this order. And I think also, I mean, this is not an easy task, where we've seen a lot of activists that came across, 2 years ago, that joined the Commonwealth community during CHOGM, calling out on member states. And we've seen even what the UK, former UK Prime Minister, when even in the opening of CHOGM, she blindly said very clearly that, what was then, which were laws that were wrong, they were wrong then and they are wrong now. And it means that we have a responsibility to repair the injustice of the past, because reality of the matter is that with those 69 countries, and even though they still decriminalize homosexual act for that matter, the fact is that the injustice still lives, because it's the history of prejudice that we need to deal with. That means you need to deal with the attitudes, behavior. But similarly, it's same for us even in South Africa. We've changed our law in 1994. And we've signed up a constitution in 96. And even when you look at now, 24 years with a constitution that is celebrated globally, it is not a real or a reality for many LGBTI people. And what we've seen over time, the very same tortures, the very same discrimination, lack of access to services, these are some of the mechanisms or realities that people are exposed to, because law enforcement or officials within government or those at service point has continuously kept a live social construction of denying people of their own rights. So it's really quite important to look at what policies by and large fail to take into account the diversity and heterogeneity of LGBTI people. Many of the LGBTI people who face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, it's intersections. So you can't look at an individual just on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity. You must consider the color of their skin. You must consider their ethnicity, their religion, their age. And in this complexity, that speaks to even the economic justice of the issues. So I thought I should bring this up. But one of the key icons that is celebrated across the globe is Nelson Mandela, who's former president of my own country, and he's celebrated because of his belief and his also just approach in fighting for social justice. Said something during his presidency, and I want to quote what he said, that no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to human heart than its opposite. I close the quote. I think it's important when we look at legally or human rights, or we look at social realities or social cohesion, what value are we talking about when it comes to human beings, when we speak about respect, dignity, rights? And as Liz has said, rights are a privilege, everything we speak about, and this privilege belongs to everybody, and we have that obligation, because that's the situation when you go into different countries. You come to South Africa, where our bodies are a site of struggle, and we continue to live around those challenges because of hate crimes, because of prejudice and discrimination. But it's the same validity that exists in other countries of denying people of their existence, whether you're talking from the Caribbean, Africa, Asia Pacific, or even Europe for that matter. And these are some of the challenges we need to consider to address. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm a little bit conscious of the time if we want to get into some, have enough time for a Q&A session. So I'm going to save my questions for you, Steve, until the end. Maybe somebody else will ask them. So Andres, can we jump to you?
Good morning to all of you. I Andres Rivera, I'm Chilean. I'm going to intervene in Spanish. I want to share with you what it means to look at the actual bill regarding recognition of gender. First of all, I want to say that legal procedures here, legal and civil procedures are quite slow. It's not because people don't want progress, it's because there's not enough respect for human rights or for rights of human beings. People of the LGBT community considered to be strange. In my case, I'm a trans man. When I started working on this bill in 2011 with different colleagues who were also trans, and looking at what we needed and studying what we needed in order to have real social inclusion and political and economic inclusion. When I was doing that analysis, I was leading a group of transsexual people, and with all that information, I formulated a bill. Took to Jimena Marchete, who was had a doctorate in law, and she put together a bill. In 2013, we took this to Congress, and we spoke to our legislators to see if we could actually get this bill into Congress. We managed to get 5 signatures from parliamentarians, and that way the actual bill entered our Congress, and then its admissibility was looked at. It took 2 years to get those 5 signatures. In 2012, the mentality that existed in Chile was that there were lots of after effects of the dictatorship, and there was also an attitude of people who were very conservative, that were very religious, and they started opposing this bill. I got the 5 signatures I needed, with great difficulty, and this bill was admitted to Congress, but it was considered to be, but the actual question of gender identity, and the bill actually had an article in it regarding rights for children, and it was considered inadmissible with that particular article. So there was a legal discussion, and so then it was, we were told we had to remove that article for the bill in its entirety to go through, Article 8. And so the bill was actually admitted to Congress. This bill went to the Human Rights Committee and debated whether trans people were human beings. And this was the Human Rights Committee of all people. And our legislators had to understand these issues. So I had to present myself as a man, and I had to present my trans colleague who's a woman, and we had to say, well, this person who looks like a man was born as a woman, and this person who's a woman was actually born as a man. And we had to explain ourselves, we had to explain our experiences, and we had to explain that they were violating our rights. Finally, there was a discussion that created a national debate where experts, lawyers, had to actually defend this bill on gender identity. And we also had people from the religious right who wanted their views respected, and they were of the view that man had created men and women in a certain way, and there could be no such thing as a man with a vagina. And we had to enter in this debate with religious people, and in those debates, we were talking that these things affected our lives. Even worse, a senator said that trans people should be prohibited from marrying, because I were to get married, and if I were to get married to a woman, though it would mean that two women with vaginas were going to get married, and two trans women couldn't get married either. And that was the kind of debate we saw going on in order to get this bill accepted. After 5 years, we have a bill that is not included children and adolescents, and we have a bill that only recognizes gender from 14 years of onwards, 14 years of age onwards. And we also have a bill where if people who are trans want to actually change their name or have their identity completely acknowledged, there are difficulties. And in Chile, we don't have the marriage amongst that's recognized amongst trans people, and so people who are married and have changes have to get divorced. And so there are lots of processes that go on in family courts for people who are trans and have children. And then for those young people between 14 and 18 years of age, they also have to go to the family courts if they want to make a transition. And if you're older than 18 and you're not married, you have to go to court and you have to have 2 witnesses. If you also want to make an application as a trans person. And we're considered not to be incompetent, and that's why we have to go take 2 witnesses. It doesn't matter whether you're 18, 30, or 50, I have got to have 2 witnesses in court with me to say, yes, this person is right. Our legislators and our current government have limited our rights, our human rights in Chile. And if that wasn't enough, apart from the situation that's presented itself, we also have very little progress in public policy for trans people. And listening to the 2 previous speakers, I found myself reflecting on something else, how lucky some of us are, and the differences that unfortunately that exist between other human beings. As a trans man, I have suffered a lot of problems. I have become part of the patriarchy, and I am part of the whole much sexist society. But people who are trans women have more rights denied to them. Women generally have more rights denied to them. They're punished more. They receive more prejudice. So unfortunately, these violations of human rights means that we can't actually construct a safe country, one that respects us all and respects all diversity. And as I was explaining early on about the advances that have been made, I think the advances we can make is going to be at the expense of our own lives and of our own bodies. And if we want to have a decent constitution that's free and just and democratic, it's going to be because of the people who have died in social demonstrations in recent years, and people who have become blinded because they've been shot at by the police in this country. Always, in order to have a right, we end up losing lives, and that cannot continue happening. The rights that we trans people have are the same rights that everyone else has, and more today, more than ever. Today, the International Day of Human Rights, we need to be very clear that every one of us are human beings, and we all have rights, and we should have the same possibilities of living a dignified life, regardless of our identity and of our gender. Dignity is the road for every human being. It cannot be that we have legislators that subject our dignity and our existence to a law or to restrictions so that for us to be able to survive and to live and to be happy, and to be a lawyer, to be a journalist, psychologist. Our lives cannot depend on the will of other people, and especially people who don't understand us. They need to understand we are all human beings. I think I've used up my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. I think that was a really powerful presentation, and thank you so much for sharing what obviously was a very, very difficult process for you and for your colleagues. I'd like to, without being a little too trite, I'd really like to understand what you're doing now the law is passed, to try and make what you said is a bad law livable, better. Because, you know, from my understanding, you're doing some great work in protecting the rights that were not protected in that law. And I think this is an important lesson for other folks around the globe that are also trying to work with bad legislation and difficult parliaments. If you don't mind, if you'd like to have a quick rest, we can come back to that question.
No, al tiro, sí, prefiero al tiro.
No, I'll answer it straight away. What I'm doing now, I'm trying to train family courts, because that's where you actually have to ask for your changes. This law has been implemented, and the people who have to apply it are the judges and the family courts, including civil officers in civil courts who have no idea who trans people are. And we have found situations where I can go and ask, and I'm going to ask for a change, but they will treat me as a woman because of my birth certificate. So we have to train the family courts and the judges so they understand the new law and understand all its implications. And also they've got to understand the concepts. Now somebody who asks for a change of gender has got to appear as a woman or a man. And we've said, well, we are just human beings. You don't have to look male or female. I'm also training adolescents at school, because we've had dreadful cases where a boy of 16 was committed suicide because he was being bullied by his school class mates, his parents, and his teachers. And it's only a year that he's been dead. Alejo Matias. So I'm trying to train schools to respect gender identity, and the work I'm doing basically, it's work I've been doing for 5 to 6 years, is to actually sensitize and educate people. And as I keep on saying, we have to put our experiences and our hearts and souls on the table. Some time ago, I actually tried to kill myself, and not because I was an alcoholic, because it wasn't because I was trans, but it was when I actually decided that I wasn't Maria Regina anymore. I was a different person. I wasn't a woman. And I felt I couldn't live any way. That's why I had an issue. And I feel that I cannot live in a country where differences are punished. I feel that differences need to be celebrated. We need to grow as human beings. We need to have a decent existence. I'm also a trainer of trainers. I'm also training teachers. I'm also training as well people at nurseries and kindergartens, so that we can get rid of this assumption that trans people are strange or weird, and we need to establish dignity and respect from a very early age. That's been a huge challenge, and I hope to continue with that and actually have safe spaces for the LGBT community, especially for trans people.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you very much. Sally, I know that you wanted to talk about your experiences with legislation, but I also know that you wanted to address this very topic about well-being and how the process can be of getting good legislation, or in some cases bad legislation, can be quite challenging for activists and initially quite hostile. So I think it's a great time to pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Sean, and good evening from Thursday evening, 9:40 in Melbourne, Australia. Buenas noches. I am on the, as is practice, I acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge my local people, Bolan Bolan, which translates into the language used in the majority today, a suburb called Bulleen, 15 kilometres east of Melbourne's central business district. For those who are visually impaired, the screen would appear that I'm roughly in the centre, have light red hair, dark red glasses, and I'm wearing a rainbow coloured scarf, and you may be able to picture in the background the trans, pan and rainbow flags behind me. So I have two situations to compare and contrast in terms of achieving legislative reform. Australia is a federation. We have a national parliament, we have 6 states and 2 territories. We also have local government, however they are less relevant for the purposes of tonight. And in 2013, when I say we, I will use LGBTI, which was the acronym used at that time, achieved some good national anti-discrimination law. For once, I was reflecting, it was almost an advantage that Australia is a large geographical area with a small population density, and that for a long time each state and territory, because of that separation, and we didn't have the technology that we have right now, perhaps worked each by themselves. And as a result, by the time we got to 2013, all 8 states and territories had achieved some degree of anti-discrimination law covering sexual orientation and gender identity. I make it clear it is not my lived expertise in terms of intersex. I don't want to comment too much on that. So when it came to 2013, we had some examples to draw on, both in terms of the desired outcome and the process. And that was really important. We were able to coordinate reasonably well around the country. Yes, by this time we had video conferencing, teleconferencing, and good broadband, which was important. And we were able to make sure that we were on the same page and approach politicians of various parties. And it was still important to have that communication to make sure that we agreed on the same points. A draft piece of law had been put forward and the gender identity definition had become somewhat dated. For example, it was not inclusive of people whose sense of identity went beyond male or female. And so we were able to approach politicians and ensure that it became more inclusive of the whole spectrum of trans and gender diverse. Whilst it is not my place to speak for intersex, there was an attribute introduced into the legislation called intersex status, and whilst it is my strong understanding intersex people here now believe that definition has become a little dated, it still gave a grounding point. And the thing was, with having the state and territory laws already in place, we were able to knock back the myths about what would happen, about how people wouldn't go to, heaven forbid, would not go to a business that employed a trans person because they didn't want to deal with them. We'd had experience of this for some time. South Australia achieved some anti-discrimination law back in 1984. So we were able to achieve that result, and that was very, very welcome through good communication across LGBTI, which, although jokes aside about distance, sometimes people had not been on the same page. So we got a good definition of gender identity. Also, under sexual orientation, the definition of bisexuality was enhanced from an original draft of attracted to both the same and the opposite sex to the same and another sex, which did allow for more flexibility in terms of non-binary gender identities and people their sexual orientation, and people attracted to those whose sense of identity is non-binary. And the result was wonderful in that 95% of politicians in each house, our federal parliament being of 2 houses, voted in favour, and in the end it was passed on voices, and that was very, very welcome. The contrast, though, came when we went to reform Victoria's birth certificate laws. Birth certificates are the responsibility of each state and territory in Australia, and I will start with 2016, where a state Labor government, our more progressive party, equivalent of the Labor Party in Britain, or perhaps the Democrats in America in very broad terms, had promised to introduce reforms to some existing laws. The problem was that in the upper house, there was not a guaranteed majority. We had 20 out of 40 seats in reasonable favour. We needed 21. And some of the independents and crossbenchers in the upper house played their cards close to their chest. So it was a gamble to go ahead and try to push the bill through. The problem also at the time was that we were in the middle of the marriage equality debate here, and that was being used against LGBTI, and I think from my perspective, sadly, particularly trans and gender diverse people. And it was very, very difficult to endure some of the opposition debates against the bill in 2016. I won't repeat details, they aren't necessary. False debates about bathrooms and threats to women, which were appalling. And when the bill reached the upper house, the bill ended up on a tie. 2 people were not there, but it was 19-19, and unfortunately, therefore, the bill was lost. And it was hugely disappointing, and having to listen to the vitriol was difficult. So we did have to take care of each other in that regard. However, an intervening state election in 2018 saw the Australian Labor Party government returned actually with an increased majority. And this time things had changed in the upper house. We had the minimum 20 again, but a few months before the legislation was introduced in 2019, an upper house MP from the party, the Animal Justice Party, Andy Medic, announced that one of his 2 children was trans, and has since actually announced his second child is also trans, which is absolutely wonderful. So we had achieved that 21 out of 40 that we needed to get the legislation through. All the same, it was important to make sure that we talked to as many of the crossbenchers in the upper house as possible to make sure that the nasty debate was at least quelled. And that is not an easy thing to do when you are in meetings with people and they're putting these things on you. And I think it is really important to always take someone with you. It's a very strong tactic. And also to debrief and even vent, if I may be dry-humoured, as quickly as possible afterwards. Melbourne, we are fortunate. We are a wonderful coffee capital of the world. So go and have a coffee with someone and release, and then go home and hit cushions or something like that. It is needed. But it was wonderful that we knew that we were going to get the law through, and in the end, it passed 26-14 in the upper house with minimal debate. And if you look through my Facebook in around late August 2019, you'll see a very tear-stained face of a picture of a selfie I took that night. And I bring that up to say that hold to the moments. When we get them, we know they're not perfect, and we always know there's more to do legally and socially. Feel those moments in your body. Do celebrate them with your supporters of all sorts, LGBTI+ and allies, and do enjoy them. It's a challenging thing, as was said. We all know of the challenges of our community, so keep doing personal development. Build yourself in all areas of your life. Be aware that there will be nasty media, for example, who will try to bait you, but learn how to deal with that. Prepare, do rehearsals with people if someone's willing to be the shock jock and play that role. Those sorts of things are good things. And also, sort of always try to just keep you calm. It is not easy. I'm not going to say I've always managed to keep my calm in all of my advocacy. We care about these things. They are heartfelt for us, but it can be done. And the thing that I do now is I just look a little across to from my viewpoint, the right of my screen. the birth certificate laws passed in 2019 came into effect on the 1st of May 2020. And within 4 days of them being into effect, I put my paperwork in to get my birth certificate that would finally say female. And for that piece of paperwork, it's not just in a filing cabinet, it is on a frame on my desk, and it keeps me motivated to do more and do what I can to reach all of our rainbow family everywhere. And all I can say is keep going, build some law, build an educative, then do some more education. I call it a legislative educative spiral. Please keep doing it. And if I may borrow a quote from Martin Luther King, which is one of my mentor's favourite quotes, the law may not change the heart, but it may restrain the heartless. And I think that's where keep fighting for that law, and it can keep improving things, and we can keep building. And an honour to speak to everyone tonight.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sally. I've just had a thought. I've seen all four of you taking copious notes. So before we throw the floor open to questions from the audience, I wondered if you had any questions for each other that you would like to ask and have people respond to. If not, that's also fine. I have a couple of questions, and then we can throw the floor open to the audience. So, I mean, if there are no follow-up questions on each other's presentations, okay, great. I have a question which I did prepare, but I think I'm going to change a little, and of course now I can't get it up on screen. So, one of the things that kind of has stuck out, and I kind of knew this before, was the fact that a lot of the work that you do, a lot of the work that you've done to get legislation approved, whether that be mediocre or good legislation, has taken a lot of time, it's taken a lot of effort. And I think it takes a lot of, at a tremendous personal cost. Now, it's kind of no secret that LGBTIQ plus populations are at the bottom end, mostly at the bottom end of any kind of economic structure. You know, there's issues of poverty, there is issues of food insecurity, and you know, economic hardship. That makes it almost impossible and increasingly necessary to sustain our own activism. The case for economic inclusion has been made, the World Bank, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there are debates, ongoing debates globally around how much it costs countries in terms of GDP. But so for me, the question then is, in the absence of such economic inclusion and the fact that us as a global movement receive the tiniest portion of development and human rights funds, is how do you sustain your activism? And in this current, as we're beginning to feel the effects of the current pandemic, who and what needs to change? From your own perspective, how do donors, how do policymakers need to rethink the support that they are giving to the global LGBT movement? And this, Steve, sorry to throw you on the spot, but I think because of the work, the important work that you're doing with the Commonwealth and with TSEN, I think this might be an interesting, you know, if you could respond first, and I'll give you kind of 1-2 minutes to respond, and then we'll open the floor.
Thanks, Sean. Look, I think there's always a primary and secondary root causes. You know, first, there's a notion that societies are structured around certain power relations which have been designed in relation to a person's sex, yeah? One's role in society determined by our genital configuration. And that's a very basic construction and all forms of violence and discrimination that comes from a defense of the power of relation. There are other factors that come from mechanisms that aim to protect those power relations, such as the idea that gay, lesbian, or trans people doesn't exist, and the stigma around them, which is enabling through the message that gay or LGBTI people are sick. And this is what we're living through, even in our own regions or in other continent as well. We've seen people being diagnosed, people having been told that it's an African to be who you are. And the aspect that has led to maintaining the system of oppression through criminalization. And I think it's quite key. And this is why we have so many LGBT people, who are on a daily basis are experiencing these challenges. A lot of work that activists are doing. I mean, Andrew was talking, exactly what all of us are actually doing on a daily basis: train, change attitude, push for legal reform, and that on its own, it's what keeps the work going through activism, through policy change as well. The other factor, which is something that we need to consider, is the whole idea that leaves the responsibility of administration, and that disturbs us, right? Because you have countries such as Brunei, you have countries such as Kenya, or countries such as St. Lucia, who have not necessarily moved faster to change their legal frameworks. Countries who play double standards, they all, if you look at what is happening at the UN, or even what is happening at Commonwealth for that matter, the whole idea of inclusivity, the whole idea of diversity, embracing human beings, and even the signatories of these Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But we have not moved, considering what is the change, what are the intentional steps that must be taken. And I think a lot of countries have been rhetoric anyway about the legal framework changes that should be taking us. It shouldn't shock us, because we know exactly what some of the social dynamics or institutions, how they influence the thinking. But I think where you are in administration, it speaks about your own obligation, your own accountability mechanism that should be exercised to ensure that we actually forward the legislative framework that recognizes gender identity, sex, and even respect the autonomy and self-determination of people.
Sorry, I had myself on mute. Anyone else volunteer a response to the question, or we can throw it open to the floor? Andrés.
Andrés. I want to apply, if I may. Can you hear me? Yep.
Sí, claro.
I want to focus on what it means to do this job, and what it means to work on the legislative, social, political, and economic fields. This job is very complicated when people don't recognize your work. There's certain limitations. First of all, people don't understand that lobbying is a work in itself, and that you have to do all of this free of charge, and you have to kind of earn. If you want your rights, you have to earn them. There's no appreciation of what you're doing. Secondly, a lot of people, especially in Latin America, people find that a lot of ideas actually derive from Europe. And we also find ourselves also limited by whether we're working alone or in a non-governmental organization. I work alone. And that makes funding difficult. I work as a teacher, but at the end of the day, I have to divide myself and I have to subsidize myself so I can actually do my activism. And you have to use your own income to actually finance your activism. And as I say, something that's occurred to me, if you want to train judges, I'm not saying that all of them, but the vast majority of them say we don't have resources. But if you want to train us, there is this space. And in schools, they say, well, we don't have resources, but we can include trans people here. So you're not only just exposing yourself, you're not just exposing your body, but you have to give up your time, your personal family quality time, in order to train people for free. There's very little recognition of your activism in the real true sense of the word, your education, your legislative work. And I think in that respect, there's a debt that funding organizations have, because they actually really should take note of this. And with all due respect, I can say that, yes, there can be funding, but you have to but the funders have to believe in the leadership of the activists. And so you have funders that were prepared to finance gay organizations, but they're not necessarily prepared to fund trans people because there's not the same respect. And something else that's very worrying, which is the developments with the pandemic. There are some very vulnerable groups, such as the trans group, that have become even more vulnerable. I've got I've got trans women who are colleagues who have been made redundant. They don't have enough for food. And I actually had to ask for government help for trans people because they weren't considered to be part of the vulnerable people group. So if the rest of the population, seems to be human beings, and that we're not. So once again, you have to interpret things a certain way, and you have to look at our perception and how trans people are perceived. And sometimes we're not even included. While people don't even think we exist, and it's quite difficult for us to get recognition and to get our rights respected.
Can we move to questions from the audience? Is that okay with folks?
Can I make 3 very quick points in answer to your question before we do that? Number 1, the cost of discrimination can be counted. It can be counted in gross domestic product. It can be counted at a country level, at a corporate level. And organizations such as Open for Business and the World Bank and so on are beginning to do that. We need to get that information and we need to use it. Secondly, I'm on the board of an organisation called Give Out, and our reason for existing is to raise money within our community, because we do have some people who have a degree of wealth within our communities, and to channel that money strategically to human rights and LGBT defenders around the world. Where the money goes is led by the people in the front line. But those of us who are busy raising it are trying to do it because we need to be much more smart about the way we do things. We have got evangelical Christian organizations in the United States of America and Europe who are funding hatred towards our communities across the globe. They're very well organized, they're very well financed. We don't have that amount of resources, but we need to be smarter. Final thing, we need to be coming up with an investment strategy for LGBT businesses, because we do have business people, we have people who run global companies, but we also have small and SME companies. So we need to be increasing the wealth within our community. With that, I'll shut up and I want to go to questions from the audience.
Great, thank you so much. Just to remind folks that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is up for review next year. It's its 10-year anniversary. So it's a good time to start engaging on getting those principles up to scratch. So we have a question from Susie Bascon, Director of Peace Brigades International, and I think it relates to what Liz has just said about human rights defenders. Susie, if you don't mind, I'm not going to read out the preamble because we're kind of I'd rather jump straight to the question. So the question is, how, in the view of the speakers, parliamentarians could play a greater role in strengthening, supporting the ongoing demands of the LGBTIQ plus at-risk collective, not just in Honduras, relates back to the question about the rate of killings in Honduras, and a great film that PBI put out last year, I believe, but also in other countries around the world.
Sorry, can you clarify the question?
Right, okay, so the question, how I understand the question is, what role can parliamentarians play in strengthening and supporting the protection of LGBTIQ+ defenders around the globe?
Well, parliamentarians have a critical role in doing that, but so too do government officials. For example, I have attended a number of international pride events in places where it is really tough to be LGBT. And it's people such as the ambassadors from European countries who have turned up literally to provide human shields on the day for pride marches to take place. I think the question that I want to answer is, how do civil society organisations go about working with politicians to enable them to be brave enough to stand up for the people in society who are really unpopular and sometimes hated? I say this to you from the House of Lords, where we are immensely privileged, but we have one great thing in our favour: we're not elected. So actually we can stand up for those people in society who are really, really unpopular, people with drug and alcohol problems, people in asylum seekers, people in prison, and all of that. And some of us take our responsibility to do that very seriously. For those people who are elected politicians, they've always got one eye on being re-elected, and therefore what you have to do as a defender is to work against those people who will play up religious and ethnic differences, cultural differences, say that being LGBT is against them, play that back to people and say that that's not right. I happen to live in a culture where 200 years ago, it was acceptable and condoned by religious authorities that white people should own black people as slaves and property. I live in a culture where 100 years ago it was condoned by the public and by religion that women were nothing more than goods and chattels in marriage, and they could be raped. Those things were the culture of the time. Culture is made by people, principally the powerful people in a society, and they're quite often men, and it can be changed by them. So what our job is to do is to enable politicians to be brave enough to take the first steps and to lead.
Okay, great, thank you. Just to quickly address another question, which I think was it for you, Andres, which was about the drafting of the new constitution and whether that would lead to an improvement of trans rights. But given the time, perhaps everybody would like to respond, kind of like a last 1 minute, 2 minute final intervention, and just on the role of constitutions on protecting rights. Andres, if you'd want to take the floor first, and then we'll...
Efectivamente tenemos la...
Well, yes. We have the challenge of rewriting our constitution in a democratic way and actually fighting for trans rights in terms of the reactions that we want. But it's incredibly complicated. Yesterday, we were watching on the news that Chilean parliamentarians can't agree on the actual quota of participation in our democracy. There are lots of fundamentalist ideas. It's going to be very difficult to actually. There's got to be a lot of. It's going to be a lot of struggling in order to actually assert trans rights. We need to have. We need to have changes so that the MPs can represent constituents in a particular positive way. We're working on violations of rights. We're actually working on roundtables and social dialogue so that we can actually change the constitution. What's clear is that we can't simply talk about men and women when there's lots of diversity, when there is lots of diversity. We need to talk about human beings. And in that sense, we need to talk about rights across the board. I know that Chile is being well regarded by the reform it's trying to make of its constitution, but there are some there's a very strong fundamentalist movement that's actually trying to clip the changes that are being planned for the constitution, and that's a threat against our rights.
Others with closing remarks before we go back to Sophia?
A constitution is only as good as the intentions of the people who wrote it, and the people and the institutions that implement it.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Look, I think for me it's really key to look at legislation with the view of a just approach of creating equality. Policies that aiming to promote, protect, and fulfill the rights, are there to create a system that understands that there's a red line, and this red line cannot be crossed or shouldn't be crossed. And it is to ensure that everybody as human beings understand that, and it's also included to be part of enjoying these rights as privileges. Thank you.
John, disculpa, solo acotar algo.
I just want to tell you something. I've just been reflecting on something because it's part of this whole process, but it's incredible that we've got to be talking about creating spaces and that we have to fight for our rights, when in reality that should be something we should have. It's a pity that we have to talk about these things as if it's like air that we breathe. It's a pity that we actually have to fight for legislation. And I'm wondering, what are we doing, and what are we doing to each other as human beings?
Gracias, Andres. Sally, any closing remarks?
Yeah, just noticing a late question that's come in only in the last minute about engagement with media. Perhaps I'll talk to that and then close very quickly. Find people across media. They are there even if they start in the smaller, more niche media, to can support your voice, and then try to get across where possible to the broader media in Australia. The general situation is that media like our Australian Broadcasting Corporation, roughly the equivalent of the BBC, generally do a good job. We have what are now called the Fairfax commercial media, who are middling, and I'll be polite and not comment on the Murdoch media and what they do. And the thing is I would close is keep building allies. There are people out there in similar positions. So it may be, say, in the disability movement is one that off the top of, to throw one off the cuff, or other movements that are similar. Find ways in, but also find allies in those people with privilege. They are there, people with a sense of social justice, and they will be able to bang down doors for you. It's not easy. I'm not going to say it is. There's many times where I wondered why and how, but I just urge people to keep going, keep reaching out for help. Occasionally take some time out if you need to. That's perfectly all right. But I would always say to people, keep moving, keep that spirit, and not just to aim for the outcomes, but going right back to that slide that Baroness Barker put up at the start. The day-to-day process of how you interact is just as important as achieving the aims, and people will be attracted overall to a sense of dignity and restraint. and a win-win solution that looks at a combination of logic and human justice.
Thank you. I would just like to say from my part, thank you all so much for participating, for staying up late, for getting up early, for being cold in that rather beautiful hall. I hope you get a chance to warm up. Just that we had a last question from Melab, who also contributed to the paper. Yeah, a great question, Melab, but unfortunately we've run out of time, and I'd like to hand over to Sophia just to do a quick wrap up.
Thank you very much. I know that we're over time, but I'd like to echo my thanks as well on behalf of WFD for all of you for sharing your wonderful experiences and thoughts today, and for those of us who joined us as participants. I take from this that our bodies are sites of struggles, but also sites of celebration, and that addressing myths, fears, misconceptions is a crucial part of building our allies and continuing the great work that we do. I hope you all read the paper, and I hope that we continue to engage. We are online on Twitter as well, and have a really great International Human Rights Day. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.